Inaugurating this year's crash course. I think this is the third time around that we've had this event, and very much like to thank John Baptiste and Anastasia and Dylan for organising it. I think it's there are many wonderful things about philosophy at Essex, but one is that so many people are willing to kind of turn out in their free time to listen to even more philosophy. I mean, you must really be addicts. So I'm going to talk today about a very interesting philosopher called... another thing I should say is that periodically I will just stop for no apparent reason, and that's because they have to reload the camera, so don't get worried about that. I'm going to talk about Jean-François Lyotard. Those are his dates up there, and Lyotard's very much regarded as one of this generation of post-structuralists, very influential generation of philosophers who include people like Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Derrida, and psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who came to fame in the 1960s. And as I'm sure many of you know, there was just a sort of incredible constellation of talent, philosophical talent, if not genius, in Paris at that time. Lyotard has a quite distinctive and interesting trajectory within the overall trajectory of post-structuralism. Those are some basic point de repère, as they say in French, reference points. He was born in Versailles, on the outskirts of Paris. He studied at the Sorbonne. He taught when you get the agrégation in France, which is the sort of higher philosophy degree, then the first thing you do is teach in a lycée, you teach in a grammar school, because philosophy is taught in grammar schools in France. So that's what Lyotard did. He taught at a lycée in Algeria, and in 1954 he joined this far-left group called Socialism and Post-Structuralism. Other very prominent members of that group were people like Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort, and they were very, very strongly opposed to the French colonial war in Algeria, which Lyotard obviously knew at first hand. So throughout the 50s, and in fact most of the 60s, he was writing predominantly sort of political stuff for Socialism and Post-Structuralism. Although in 1954 he did write a little introduction to phenomenology. And then in 1971 he published this book called Discours Figure, which is the book that I'm going to talk about today. I think it's in many ways his most interesting and most enduring philosophical achievement. And then in 1974 he published a book called Économie libidinale, which has a lot of similarities in its basic philosophical outlook with the kinds of arguments that you find in the Anti-Oedipus of Deleuze and Guattari, which was published about the same time. And then he really became world famous in 1979 when he published a little book called La Condition Postmoderne. And at that time the word postmodern and postmodernity was on everyone's lips. It was the latest trend in cultural analysis, and Lyotard became very famous for encapsulating the idea of the postmodern in what he calls the end of grand narrative, by which he means sort of large-scale narratives about the development of history, and usually of a progressive character. And then in 1973 he published a book called Le Différent, which in French doesn't mean difference, it means something more like point of dispute, something like that. I mean, there are similarities, there are threads which go throughout his work, but one of the features of Lyotard is that he's quite chameleon-like. Hegel once said, sort of in a put-down of Schelling, that Schelling conducted his education in public. And I think you could say something similar about Lyotard. Lyotard conducted his education in public. He kept changing his position quite dramatically from one book to the next. And so these are really stages on a journey in which his philosophical position changes considerably. But as I said, the book that I'm going to concentrate on is Discours Figure, because it raises a lot of very crucial questions which are central to the whole post-structuralist enterprise. Okay, so what is Lyotard talking about in Discours Figure? Well, Lyotard had attended Lacan seminars in the mid-1960s. In the 60s, Lacan was terribly fashionable. If you were anybody, you had to go to his seminar. And however, Lacan is one of the targets of Lyotard in this Discours Figure. The reason for that is that Lyotard thinks that the structuralist model of language has been overextended, it has been stretched beyond its capacity in writers like Lacan and indeed like Derrida. So this touches on the relation between structuralism and post-structuralism. And I suppose one way of putting this would be to say, well, there's a first phase of post-structuralism in which, as it were, the structuralist notion of language is put into motion. It's made more mobile, it's made more dynamic than it is in the sort of structuralism which was popularised by the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss in the late 50s, early 60s. But the essential model of language, the essential conception of what language is not really challenged. And one of the things that Lyotard wants to do in Discours Figure is actually to question that basic underlying conception of language. So here you can see, for example, that one of Lacan's many gnomic utterances is that the unconscious is structured like a language. And Jacques Derrida said a little sentence once which has given rise to reams of debate, namely that il n'y a pas de hors texte, which literally translated means something like there is nothing. Literally it means there is no outside text. There is no outside text. But it's often translated as there is nothing outside. There is nothing outside the text. So this is what Lyotard is not happy about. He doesn't like this. So on the first page of the main text of Discours Figure, he says, this book protests that the given is not a text, that there is within it a constitutive thickness, or rather a difference, which is not to be read, but to be seen. That this difference and the immobile mobility which reveals it is what is constantly forgotten in the signifier. So that's like a kind of declaration of war, really, against the post-structuralists, insofar as they're still wedded to this linguistic paradigm whose origins we'll look at in a bit more detail in a moment. So a little bit later he says something similar. He says, we can move to the figure, we'll see a bit later in more detail what we mean by the figure, by showing that every discourse has that which confronts it, the object of which it speaks, which is over there as what is designated within a horizon, a view on the edge of discourse, okay? So he's playing off the idea of a view or what is seen against the idea of the signifier. So one philosophical question which is coming up at this point would be, well, is he being naive? You know, Derrida says il n'y a pas de hors texte, so how can Lyotard appeal to something which is hors texte without being naive about the relation between language and the world? So that's obviously an issue to bear in mind. Right, so in order to understand what he's attacking here, we have to look a little bit closer at the structuralist model of language. Essentially what happened is that back in the early years of the 20th century, a very influential book was published posthumously called Course in General Linguistics. It's a book that was put together by the pupils of a famous Swiss linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure. Those are the dates up there. And I mean, this had a tremendous influence on the development of linguistics itself as a science in the early years of the 20th century. But also what happened in France is that it was taken up by Claude Lévi-Strauss, the famous anthropologist in the post-war period, and Lévi-Strauss thought that he could apply something like Saussure method of analysis to analyse anthropological data, for example, kinship systems. And from then on it spread into a whole notion of semiotics. So Saussure himself had said that the study of language was simply one branch of a more general theory, which he called semiotics, which is the theory of signs. And so the idea was that semiotics could be applied across the whole sphere of culture. And this became a very influential idea in France, particularly in the late 50s and the early 1960s. So what are the basic principles of Saussurian linguistics? Well, the first thing is that language should be studied as a synchronic system. This is what Saussure calls langue, as opposed to parole. By a synchronic, what Saussure is arguing against there is the kind of historical linguistics or philology, which was very prominent in the 19th century, whereby people studying language were interested in the evolution of language. And Saussure says, no, what I'm going to do is just take a chronological cross-section, as it were. What I'm interested in is how language functions as a system, as a kind of as a synchronic system, by taking a kind of cross-section of language at a particular point in time. I'm not interested in history, I'm not interested in development, because those aspects of language can't be treated systematically and they can't be treated scientifically. The next fundamental point he makes is that in language there are only differences. In language there are only differences. So the point about this is that it does not matter how you pronounce the A in the word last. Well, in English, I mean, I'm from the Midlands, so I say last, okay? But down here in the south, you say last. Well, in the 18th century, that would have been very rustic. I mean, you would have been a hayseed if you'd said last. So those things change over time. But the point is that as long as it doesn't sound like lost, or as long as it doesn't sound like lest, you've got the word last or last. Okay. So it doesn't matter exactly how you pronounce the vowel, as long as it doesn't get mixed up with these other vowels. Okay. So it doesn't have. There's no precise pronunciation of the vowel A, which is necessary in order to identify that word. That's what Saussure means by saying that in language there are only differences, and a very famous analogy he gives for this idea about language is a particular train. So the 8:30 train to Geneva is the one that's before the 9 o'clock train and after the 8 o'clock train, but it doesn't mean it's made up of the same locomotive and the same carriages every day. The locomotive and the carriages can be completely different. So it's not the materiality of the train which makes it the 8:30, it's just its differential location in relation to the 9 o'clock train and the 8 o'clock train. So that's a pretty precise analogy for this idea that it's not the specific quality of the phoneme which counts, but just your ability to differentiate it from other phonemes. So that's what's meant by the priority of differences. Okay. Now, one very significant thing about this is that for Saussure it applies also to what he calls the signified as well as the signifier. So this is Saussure's basic notion of what he calls a sign, which is the basis of his general semiotics. It's a conjunction of a signifier and a signifier. The signifier is the kind of materiality of the sign, so that could be the sound, it could be a graphic mark on paper or whatever it is. The signifier, there's a real bit of a puzzle about exactly what Saussure thinks the signifier is. But it's the kind of meaning aspect of the sign, or what the sign stands for, as opposed to the material element which actually communicates the meaning or affects the representation. So one consequence of Saussure's view, which again got the post-structuralists very excited, was it's not just the signifier, as we've seen, which is distinguished differentially, but also the signified. So I like to, as it were, dramatise this a little bit by saying that in French there's no such thing as a handle. There are no handles in France. Okay? Why not? Well, if it's on a drawer or a door, it's une poignée. If it's on a bucket or a cup, it's une anse. If it's on a water pump or a wheelbarrow, it's un bras. And if it's on a hammer, a spade, a knife or a fork, it's une manche. Okay? So they have 4 different words for what we call a handle. So this shows you how not just the signified, but the signified is divided up differentially within language. Similarly in France, they have 2 kinds of rivers. They have un fleuve and une rivière. Un fleuve is a river which flows into the sea. Une rivière is a river which doesn't. Okay? So we've got 2 different kinds of rivers that we don't have. I'm feeling deprived. So that's the basic idea. So this, if you like, was the kind of French way of making a point about language, which comes into the English-speaking world, for example, via the later philosophy of Wittgenstein, where Wittgenstein shows that you can't understand language as attaching labels to pre-existing bits of the world. Okay? You just cannot draw that distinction between language and the world in the way that, so you can't understand language representationally, as if the world of objects is out there and then you just stick labels on it. It doesn't work like that. The world is actually articulated by language. So in the English-speaking world, Wittgenstein was one of the people who taught us that, although you could have learnt it from Hegel actually. But in France, it came through via Saussure. But I mean, this is going to be worrying for Lyotard because it's going to suggest that, well, everything is structured by language. So what is this relation between seeing and reading that he wants to put so much emphasis on? So, or speaking and seeing, the figural. He wants to talk about the figural. The figural is not the same as the literal. Literal in the literal sense of relating to letters. Okay, the figural and the literal. So he says, to speak is always to speak of something, and this dimension of reference, which the structuralist method neglects by hypothesis, is nothing other than the presence of the distantiation of seeing in the experience of discourse. Okay? So there's a dimension of reference in language, which is just not captured by the structuralist method. I mean, some critics of structuralism would say this is because actually structuralism doesn't get as far as propositions. It doesn't get as far as whole sentences. This is in fact the way that another French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, criticises Derrida. He says, well, look, Jacques, you're still hung up on the sign, the individual semiotic unit, but that's no good. You're not really going to get a grip on language until you start considering sentences as a whole. And sentences talk about stuff, okay? They refer to the world. And so you can't, there's a kind of, we get stuck in the starting blocks with structuralism because we don't even move to that level in which we're talking about the world. So this is one of the points that Lyotard wants to make here. So there's the presence of the distantiation of seeing in the experience of discourse. We've got seeing and we've got discourse. But what is this seeing and what is seen? Now, in Discours Figure, Lyotard's very influenced by Merleau-Ponty. I mean, I said that his first book was about phenomenology, and he was very much raised, as all philosophers of his generation were, in the traditions of phenomenology and Hegelian Marxism. I mean, if you weren't a Hegelian Marxist, you were basically zilch in the 1950s in France. And then it took people like Foucault and Deleuze to sort of rebel against that whole kind of oppressive Hegelian Marxist thing. Lyotard's outlook as a member of Socialism and Post-Structuralism was very much influenced by that, as well as by phenomenology. It's a kind of coalescence of phenomenology and Hegelian Marxism. And he's particularly interested in Merleau-Ponty. So he says, Lyotard takes from Merleau-Ponty the notion that seeing is the apprehension of a mobile perceived world. You know, you remember that quote I gave you earlier on when he talks about a mobile immobility, or an immobile mobility, I can't remember. What does he mean by that? Well, what he's referring to is the fact that the perceived world is constantly shifting and changing as you move around, but it's also immobile in the sense that you, as an experienced subject, are always at the centre. You're always, as it were, the point of origin of what you experience and what you perceive. So there's a kind of paradoxical relation between immobility and mobility in the experience of the perceived world. So we apprehend a mobile perceived world in which the relation between elements is not differentially determined. So this is a basic point he wants to make. The perceived isn't what Merleau-Ponty calls an ambiguous field of horizons and distances. So one of the points that Lyotard is making there is that the elements of the perceived world, insofar as we can distinguish elements at all, and we probably can't radically distinguish elements, those elements are not differentially related in the way that the elements of language are, or the elements of a semiotic system are differentially related. Okay? So that's a fundamental mistake that the post-structuralists are making. And when Derrida says things like there's no such thing as perception, which is a bit of a striking claim to make, that he's saying that Derrida means by that there's no such thing as perception unless you acknowledge that the perceived is totally differentially structured, so there's no presence. But Lyotard rejects that. And at this point in the book anyway, he endorses Merleau-Ponty's notion that the perceived is an ambiguous field of horizons and distances. Now, one of the interesting things about Merleau-Ponty is that he doesn't completely deny that there is a differential element in perception. He does talk about this in his second major posthumous work, which is called The Visible and the Invisible. So Merleau-Ponty concedes, for example, that this is the example I've given, the redness of a rose implicitly contrasts with the redness of a pillar box or the redness of a fire. So Merleau-Ponty concedes that when you experience a particular red, there is something differential going on in your mind. You're contrasting it with other experiences of red, different experiences of red, and that is a component, that is an element in your perception. But at the same time, he wants to say it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story. He wants to say there is also something intrinsic about the colour. So we could perhaps dramatise this by saying, you know, could green or white signify passion as well as red does? Okay? I'm sure there are some perverse people out there who are going to argue that but the point is that you can't understand colour in purely differential terms. There's something intrinsic about quantity of colours, okay? And you can't grasp that if you're operating on exclusively structuralist premises. Okay? So that's one of the points that Merleau-Ponty wants to make. And he says, similarly, a line in a painting or a drawing does not signify in the same way, as writing which appears in the artwork. Writing erases itself in favour of its meaning. The figural resists such appropriation. Well, at that point, Lyotard gives the example of a painting by Paul Klee called Fatal Jump, in which Klee writes Fatal Jump at the bottom. I mean, Klee often writes stuff on his paintings. And what the basic point he wants to make is that the writing, you don't absorb the writing, you don't grasp the meaning of the writing in the same way as you, as it were, encounter the actual figural character of the painting or the drawing. So the figural resists appropriation, where, you know, it's clearly the case, you know, as you're listening to me now, you're not listening to you're not listening to my Midlands accent, okay? You may start to now, but you were listening to what I was saying, okay? You were absorbing the meaning. You were just going straight through the sound in order to get to the meaning. And that's the way language operates because of its conventionality. But I mean, these are all pretty obvious things, but you know, philosophers get into a kind of dogmatic track and they can't see anything that contradicts what they're insisting on. So this, you know, it may all seem very platitudinous, but this was quite radical for someone to say this at the high point of the dominance of structuralism. Well, I couldn't find Fatal Jump online, but I did find They're Biting, okay? And in They're Biting, there's a kind of exclamation mark right in the middle of the painting. That's another clay painting. So okay, you can, as it were, contemplate the exclamation mark just as another figural element, but you also read it as an exclamation mark. Okay. So when you read it as an exclamation mark, you're apprehending it in a different way than you are. It's a great sort of joke in the middle of the painting. You're apprehending it in a different way because it's a conventional sign. You know what an exclamation mark means. You can just immediately read off something from it. Whereas you could spend hours kind of looking at what's going on in that painting. So that's the basic point that Lyotard is trying to make there. Okay, so far, Lyotard has been prosecuting what looks like a kind of phenomenological critique of the excesses of linguistic structuralism and linguistic post-structuralism, and leaning quite a lot on Merleau-Ponty. One of the kind of interesting things about the book, about Discours Figure, is that he kind of changes horses halfway through the book. So he starts by writing Merleau-Ponty, and he goes into what's it called, the changing station, and he comes out writing on Freud. So there's a kind of switch. There's a continuity, but there's also a switch in the middle of the book. So at a certain point, although he's used Merleau-Ponty, he starts to register a dissatisfaction with this phenomenological approach. And what he doesn't like is this kind of continuity, or this kind of harmonistic element of Merleau-Ponty's thinking. So, for example, Merleau-Ponty says things like, language realises in breaking the silence that which silence wished for yet could not obtain. So Merleau-Ponty is almost sort of saying, well, the silence, you know, the silent world of perception or whatever, it wants to speak, it wants to articulate itself, and sort of language is that gift which enables it to express that articulation which is already implicit. So there's a continuity between language and the perceived world. So you find very often you find particularly in late Merleau-Ponty, you find expressions like incarnate logos. There's an incarnate logos, or a proto-logos, if you like, in the perceived world, which language teases out, which language crystallizes, but there's no radical break between the perceived world and language. You might think that's a little bit too cozy. There's a famous article by Jean-Paul Sartre on Merleau-Ponty where he basically says Merleau-Ponty must have had a really happy childhood, he must have had a really nice mum. Because he thinks that everything just flows harmoniously together. Where's the break? Where are the ruptures? Where is the antagonism? Where's the fragmentation? And that's sort of the sort of criticism that Lyotard starts to articulate of this Merleau-Ponty position, parts of the way, about halfway through the book. So I think what I'm calling the coup de génie, you know, the brilliant stroke in Discours Figure, is to grasp the similarity between Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological description of the perceived world and Freud's description of the primary process. Okay, so as some of you know, have been in my Freud class this term, the primary process characterised by mobility of cathexis, instability and visuality, tendency towards hallucinatory satisfaction, as opposed to the fixed differences of long, which you could very much connect with Freud's definition of the secondary process, which he says is bound. Freud says it's bound energy as opposed to free floating energy or free moving energy. So Lyotard is basically saying, look, there's a really striking parallel between the perceived world as it's described in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology and what Freud says about the primary process. And this is really interesting. So at this point, we could say, however, that there is an element. I said that Lyotard sat in on, attended Lacan's seminars in the 60s, along with the rest of fashionable Paris. But he has been influenced by Lacan's claim that language, as it were, cuts us off from primordial contact with things. Language does introduce a kind of cut, which Lacan theorises as castration, which separates us from the perceived world. So there isn't this kind of continuity that Merleau-Ponty evokes, and Lacan says things like the symbol is the death of the thing. I think that might be Malon, but anyway, Lacan says it as well. So once we're installed in language, in some sense we are cut off from the perceived world. But Lyotard doesn't want to endorse all the consequences that flow from this for a structuralist or a post-structuralist like Lacan. So Lacan says, for him, this does not mean that we are now installed exclusively within language, which forms a fully autonomous or transcendental domain. If you say language is transcendental, you're saying it's basically the a priori condition for our experience, so all our experience is structured by this a priori condition. And Lyotard doesn't want to draw that consequence from the Lacanian argument. So he thinks of things more in this kind of way. He wants to say this tearing away, this is another Lacanian element, he wants to say this tearing away from this primordial immersion in the world, in which you could say there isn't really a clear separation between subject and object, between what is perceived and the perceiver. This is what Freud calls primal repression. This is primal repression. Okay? But it doesn't work quite the way that Lacan suggested it works. So he says that the supposed doubling of the pre-world by language does not, I've repeated that, sorry, does not simply open up the distance in which the I is installed in the edge of discourse. This tearing away produces effects of distortion within discourse. A figure is installed in the depths of our speech, which operates as the matrix of these effects, which attacks our words in order to make them into forms and images. By Entspeiung, the object is lost. By means of the fantasy, it is represented. Entspeiung is a word which goes back to Hegel and the German idealists, and it basically means the process whereby we as self-conscious beings are separated off, cut off from the world which we might be immersed in primordially before we achieve the self-consciousness which Hegel thinks is characteristic of spirit. So there's an Entspeiung, there's a direction, it's sometimes translated as direction, there's a direction, the object is lost, and then it's restored in the form of fantasy, but this fantasy is not simply a linguistic phenomenon, it's not something that can be articulated purely linguistically. It actually it attacks our words. It's not expressed through our words, it attacks our words, okay? So that's a difference in Lyotard's approach. So this is an example he gives. He imagines a flag with the words Révolution d'Octobre written on them. Okay, I don't need to translate that, hopefully. And then the flag starts flapping in the breeze. Okay, and as it flaps in the breeze, it folds up somewhat. It crunches up, and you can only perceive some of the letters. You can't perceive all the letters. And you can only perceive REVO, then N, then D, apostrophe OR, Revendor, which translates, if you do a homophonic translation, becomes in French Revendor, which means let us dream of gold. Okay? So we've got from revolution to let us dream of gold by this process of distortion of language, okay? This attacking of language by the fantasy. And this is very different from Lacan's conception. This is Lacan's basic model of what he calls metaphor and metonymy, which are the two dimensions of the dream work, which Freud describes as displacement and condensation. So Lacan's basic idea is that you have a subject which can only articulate itself or only represent itself in a signifier. This is a kind of Sartrean element in Lacan, actually. As soon as it represents itself in terms of a signifier, it congeals. It's reified, it's no longer the subject, okay? So then you need another signifier to try and grasp the subject, which is, as it were, disappeared in the signifier. That's what Lacan calls fading, okay? He uses the English word. The subject fades into the signifier, is absorbed by the signifier. Because the subject, the pure subject is just lack for Lacan. Well, how do you represent lack? That's the sort of way of putting the problem. As soon as you represent lack in the signifier, it's no longer a lack. Okay, so then you need another signifier, and then you need another signifier, and another signifier. And that's the way Lacan thinks that language works, and that's the way he thinks the relation between the subject and the language works. So Lacan says that the signifier is that which represents the subject for another signifier. Okay? He turns Saussure upside down, as it were. He likes turning things upside down. He says the signifier is that which represents the subject for another signifier. But what you don't get in Lacan is this kind of disruption, I think, that Lyotard illustrates with that example of the flag. Okay. Another example that he uses in the book. So this is Freud uses the example of a rebus. He talks about a rebus. Freud in the Interpretation Dreams, which is a picture puzzle, as his a way of illustrating how dreams work. And the point that Lyotard is making is that you can't understand a rebus in purely semiotic terms, or you can't understand a rebus in purely differential Saussurean terms. Okay? There's a figural element that you have to apprehend and make sense of, which isn't coded in the way that language is coded. So this is a French rebus. So we've got a nose surrounded by a circle of bees. Okay. So that could be un nez, which is the French for nose. Ça, which means surrounded in French, encircled or surrounded. Un nez, ça, d'abeille. A nose surrounded by bees. Homophonically, we can then get an essaim d'abeille, which is the French for a swarm of bees. Okay, so that's the solution to the rebus. But Lyotard's point is that you can't do that. The ça bit, the surrounded bit, is figural. You can only apprehend that figurally. It's not differentially coded in the way that linguistic expressions are differentially coded. So he thinks that there's just something seriously wrong with this exclusive concentration on language, both in relation to our experience of the perceived world, but also in relation to the understanding of the unconscious. And of course he wants to say that his interpretation is much closer to Freud and to Freud's distinction between primary and secondary process than it is to the kind of Lacanian version of Freud, which becomes much too linguistic. So that's the basic point that he wants to make there. Okay, so I'm just getting close to the end now. So we've had the Merleau-Pontian arguments about perception, the relation between language and perception. Then we've had the arguments about the nature of the unconscious, in which he's tackling Lacan. But discours figure is basically a work of aesthetics. What Lyotard is heading towards is a theory of the work of art. So this is what I wanted to say a little bit now. And the basic mechanism that he he thinks he's operating works of art, or maybe it's just modernist works of art, I'm not sure whether this has some kind of temporal restriction. It's what he calls renversement or reversal. Okay? So, reversal. He says the work of art exposes the gap between the discursive and the figural. Okay? So there's a gap between the discursive and the figural, which, as we saw, structuralism and post-structuralism can't take account of. What the work of art does is, as it were, to highlight this gap between the discursive and the figural. So it lays bare the disorder of the unconscious rather than absorbing it into a hallucinatory fulfillment. So in fantasy, there's a function of hallucinatory fulfillment. This difference, this gap is absorbed into the fantasy representation, and we get absorbed into it. It doesn't highlight this disjunction. So he says that the artist does not produce outside the systems of internal figures, but is someone who tries to struggle in order to deliver in the fantasy, in the matrix of figures of which he's the location and the inheritor, that which is, in the proper sense, primary process and not repetition or writing. He's obviously referring to, that's an allusion to Derrida. I mean, French philosophers very rarely sort of have polite debates in journals, you know, where they argue against each other's positions. But they just put in a kind of nasty footnote, and they often don't even, you know, say who they're referring to. That's what Lyotard's doing there. You know, that one word is a kind of, there we go. You know. So that which is in the proper sense, primary process and not repetition or writing, the fantasy makes opposition out of difference. By opposition, Lyotard here means a differential relation in the structuralist sense. So the fantasy makes opposition out of difference. In other words, there's a difference between the figural and the discursive, which is absorbed by the fantasy, whereas poetics remakes difference with this opposition. So poetics remakes difference out of the opposition between the absorption of difference into opposition and the refusal of difference to be absorbed into opposition. That's his basic conception of what poetics or what the work of art does. Okay? So there's an element of disruption in the work of art, which is displayed in a way it's sort of displaying its own limit. It's displaying its own, and this fits much better, perhaps, but when Michaela would say more about this, with kind of modernist conceptions of art than it does maybe with earlier phases in the history of art. I don't know. So as it were, I mean, it's very close in a way to Adorno's aesthetics. You know, Adorno is very hostile to sort of notions of aesthetic harmony, notions of aesthetic unity. He thinks it's fine if you just listen to one movement of a Beethoven symphony. You don't have to feel embarrassed that you're listening to classic FM, because you know, fragmentation is the name of the game. So that's all part of, you know, the fact that the work of art is highlighting its own lack of harmony or integrality is an important feature of it. So that's basically what Lyotard is also theorising in Discours de Figure. Okay. Last slide. Okay. So this was Lyotard was very involved. You know, he was in socialism with Barbary, and then he was a teacher at Nanterre in the 60s, where they had massive, you know, which was the epicenter of the student movement in '68, and the workers and student movement. He was very, very deeply involved in it. Here are some lovely posters from that epoch. Beauty is in the street, that one says. The struggle continues. Reform, chloroform. So the last move that Lyotard makes, he only really gestures towards it in Discours de Figure, is to say that the kind of street theatre and the kind of disruptive forms of political demonstration activity which the sort of he was involved in something called the movement, the 22nd of May movement, the 22nd of March movement has an analogy to this disruptive process of the work of art. So that you're actually breaking through the kind of glassy spectacle of advanced capitalism. You're disrupting its routines, its kind of semiotic fixity, and you're allowing this kind of primary process to come to the surface. So he thinks there's a kind of analogy between the kind of street theatre, political activity that he was involved in, and his theorisation of the work of art. And just to make a final point about how clever Lyotard is, the title of the book, Discours Figure, is itself figural, okay? It's a figuration of the difference between discours and figure. It's not just a linguistic or semiotic statement of the relation between discours and figure. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much. Something green, apprehending greenness, is not the same as saying that is green. I mean, in a way, it goes back to the first chapter of the phenomenology, sense certainty. These questions have been going around for a long time. But is there something phenomenological there that you can't be purely absorbed into language? And there's another point I was going to make. Oh, I've got the. Yeah, so that's basically what he's saying. Oh yes, I know. He says at one point that language is the phenomenological, but not the ontological ground of the perceived world. Okay, that language is the phenomenological, but not the ontological ground of the perceived world. So in a way, he's saying yes. It's only because we are linguistic beings that we are capable of this kind of reflective form of perception that we have, in which, unlike an animal, we can actually say that's green, that's square, whatever, that's oblong, or but that doesn't make language the ontological ground of the perceived world. That doesn't reduce the perceived world to language, even though language is a condition for us to have a perceived world. It doesn't make the perceived world the same as language. That's the basic point he has to make.
Yes. One is the one that you wrote, there is nothing outside the text.
Yes.
And the other one, there is no outside the text.
Yes.
And I think there might be a difference there. I mean, there is nothing outside the text. Is postulating that the only thing that exists is language.
Yes.
Whereas the other one doesn't say anything necessarily about existence, independent of language.
Right.
I mean, not affirming, but not denying either.
You mean when he says there is no outside text in the full text? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you see, it's a kind of tricky debate, because a sort of Derrida would say, well, all Derrida is saying is there's nothing which is purely extra-linguistic, or there's nothing which is purely non-linguistic. There's nothing radically odd text. So that would go back to what I was saying a minute ago about the fact, yes, language is a condition for us to have the kind of perception that we do. But does that mean that everything is semiotically structured? Does that mean that everything is linguistically structured? And I think that what you don't find in Derrida is a very strong claim, in his early work anyway, that there is anything which is not linguistically structured or not differentially structured. Because his work, Derrida's word différence, is like this kind of inverted version of a first principle. I know you probably disagree with this, but this is my reading of it. It's a kind of back to front, topsy-turvy, primordial principle, which means that he's saying everything is generated by différence, and that is really where the dividing line is. Because, as I said when I was talking about colour perception. Even though Merleau-Ponty acknowledges there is a differential element to colour perception, he doesn't think it goes all the way down. You know, the quality of colours or the meaning of colours is not purely differential. Red is not what it is just because it's different from green and yellow. It has an inherent quality. And if you think that there is some anti-principle called différence, you can't really take account of that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if you could clarify how exactly the work of art shows us the opposition or makes this opposition, and also how the perceiver of art experiences this. So is it experienced as a rupture,
Yes.
or more as a sort of clarificatory type thing?
Yes.
And if you could give some more examples of works of art that would help us understand how
Yes.
this difference shows up.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I mean, basically what he's saying is that that a work of art is not just the fulfillment of a fantasy. Okay, so you know, as I said during the talk, he was very politically active at this time. So he's obviously comparing sort of what he regards as genuine artworks with, say, for example, advertising, or the whole kind of discourse of consumer capitalism, which is about offering people fantasies in which they can kind of fulfill various kinds of drives. And so the basic point he's making is that there's something about the work of art that resists that. You know, you can't just see this as the fulfillment of a fantasy. However you try to interpret it, there's something that doesn't fit. There's something that kind of disrupts your interpretation. There's always another element. There's always a different element. So you can never fully assimilate it to some kind of just fantasy fulfillment, whatever it might be. Yeah. The very figural element of art, which is something that you have to dwell on, that you can't just absorb, is itself a kind of resistance to this kind of omnipresence of semiotics. That's the point.
Any other questions?
My question is actually also about what you were just saying about with the exclamation point, that there is a specific conventional meaning of it. It's almost like a code. But that's not the case with everything else that's around it.
Yeah.
You can dwell on it and you can submerge yourself in it. But so I was thinking about all the kinds of art, like two different kinds actually. The first one is a work of art that is created out of words, but not like a literature or something. That's what I'm going to next. But like recently, I read on this piece of art, which was an artist who wrote words in practically all the languages in the world on a wall, all on top of each other. So it was language, and there was meaning to the words, but at the same time, it's art, and there's something that you can't, there's like you can just dwell in it, and it's just, so that's an interesting thing to think about, because it seems like you're making this opposition between the literal and the figural.
Yes.
But there are works of art which seem to have both of them in it, and I think especially for something like literature or poetry, maybe even some philosophy, you can dwell on it.
Yes. Yes.
And it just.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. I think that the figural element in poetry. I mean, I think Lyotard, he would be, if he's going to be consistent, he has to say yes. There's a figural element in poetry as well, but the figural element is not in the language as such. It's not in the way that the language works on the purely kind of differential Saussurian level. It's in the kinds of images that are coming up in the language, and the kind of disjunctions between images, and that's where the figural element figural elements is coming up.
That's not only in poetry or literature, right?
No. But he's very much concentrating on the visual arts. You know, that was his particular interest, and he wrote a lot about the visual arts. Not just in this book, but he wrote about Marcel. He published a whole book about Marcel Duchamp. He wrote a lot of essays about painting and drawing. So that was his sort of primary interest. But obviously, you'd have to be able to extend that and to say, well, you find the same thing in music, you find the same thing in literature. But what he would be highlighting is this deliberate disruption of harmony, like, you know, the use of dissonance in sort of 20th century music, sort of from sort of Schoenberg onwards, or even earlier than that actually. The use of dissonance, the use of clashes, the use of sort of friction and conflict between different elements, which you can't fully reconcile into a kind of nice harmonious whole. Yeah? But that's very much part of the kind of aesthetics of modernism, I think, in general, that you kind of eschew the idea of a kind of harmonious totality, which was the way that sort of romantic, or not, no, actually not romantic, because you already find that in Schlegel, you already find it in the German Romantics, this kind of celebration of the fragment. But going back to classical aesthetics, it's all about harmony and integration and so on and so forth, and that's what he's arguing against.
So once again with the figure, does it somehow map onto Merleau-Ponty's notion of chiasm?
Chiasm.
Yeah. Or is it similar? And if that's the case, does it also work as this sort of repository of substrate?
Substrate, yeah.
Where text acquires stuff or picks up stuff,
Yeah.
or what's the relationship with the two?
Yeah. Well, chiasm is that's the term which is used in Merleau-Ponty's later work. Can I draw it? And it comes from the Greek. It comes from the Greek letter chi, which is written like that. So it's almost like a cross, but it's not quite a cross because the two lines are different. Yeah, that's the letter chi. So what that means in Merleau-Ponty and in some other philosophers is that there's a kind of interchangeability, there's a kind of possibility of swapping positions, but it's not a pure symmetry. So Merleau-Ponty wants to say things like, you know, the world. I look at the world, and the world looks back at me, and there's no strict distinction between the perceiver and the perceived. In a way, he's trying to dig down to this level. I mean, as so many philosophers do, really. I mean, particularly 20th century philosophers, prior to the kind of categorical distinction between subjects and objects. You know, so this is what, in a way, connects phenomenology with German idealism. You know, there's a famous there's a book by a Hungarian psychoanalyst called Edith Barnett, which is called "Before I Was I." Yeah? That's the title of the book, and that's kind of what sort of Merleau-Ponty phenomenology is interested in, or that's what sort of Schelling and Hegel are interested in. You know, well, what was there before I was I? And that means before there was this distinction between me over here and the world over there. Yeah? We can't take that as primordial. So that's what Merleau-Ponty means by the chiasm. Yeah, there's a kind of swapping backwards and forwards between subject and object. But it can't be purely symmetrical because, you know, I'm still the perceiving subject. There's still a kind of weight on the side of the perceiving subject. I mean, those of you who've studied, I mean, John is keen, unity of apperception, the synthetic and the analytic unity of apperception. Is the synthetic unity dependent on the analytic unity, or is it the other way around? Or are they interdependent? Well, it's both. Oh, damn it. They're interdependent, but one is also wearing the trousers. So it's a sort of similar kind of thing here. But what Merleau-Ponty, what Lyotard doesn't like, comes to disagree with is he thinks in Merleau-Ponty this is too harmonistic. There's this kind of nice, cosy interchange between me and the world, and I'm bathing in this kind of perceptual sort of soup. So where's this disruptive? Where's the uncanny? What Freud calls the uncanny, the unheimlich. Where's the uncanny, disruptive, anxiety-generating, disruptive aspect of fantasy? He thinks that that's lacking in Merleau-Ponty, so that's why he sort of moves on. So to a more Freudian perspective.
But in the visible and the invisible, like Merleau-Ponty, I think refers to the chiasm as the in between of the intersensor, but as no link in any language. It cannot be. It can only be pointed towards. There's a disruption.
Well,
so far as it is in text, so it sounds a bit like what Lyotard was saying. It's similar. I understand that, as you put it, the metaphor, changing of words.
Yeah.
Since Merleau-Ponty himself also really account for
Yeah.
the anxiety, as you put it, it does seem to map out to that.
Yeah. Well, all I can do is repeat what I said a minute ago, that Lyotard thinks there isn't a sufficiently disruptive element in the Merleau-Ponty view. So, so it is the case, if you read late Merleau-Ponty, and if you, for example, read the notes, the working notes to the visible and the invisible. So this, the Invisible was not finished at his death. It was published posthumously. So there are a lot of notes at the back of the book, little fragments of things that he put down. He talks about things like the incarnate logos and so forth. So, it's not dissimilar to this current debate in post-analytical philosophy between McDowell and some of his critics, about whether there is any such thing as non-perceptual content. It's sort of related to that. Sort of Merleau-Ponty say he wants a sort of halfway position. Well, we don't want to say that the pre-linguistic, pre-conceptual world is totally conceptually structured, but it's kind of proto-conceptual. That's what he means by talking about incarnate logos. It's already got some kind of proto-articulation, which language then, as it were, brings to fulfillment. That's the kind of idea that Merleau-Ponty's got. Whereas Lyotard decides he wants more friction. He wants more of a disruptive relationship between this, the figural and discursive. So that's why he moves towards this Freudian model of primary, secondary process. He thinks that that's a sort of better way of trying to think about this relationship.
You talked about Merleau-Ponty's position on phenomenology, and you said he admits that there is a differential character to qualia, that's right, but that there's also an intrinsic character.
Yes.
First of all, does Lyotard accept this position? Is it Lyotard's position as well? And secondly, this seems to me to be a very curious position to take, because there seem to be at work two different and contrasting models of explanation, at least.
Yeah.
Okay, on the difference model, red is what it is in virtue of there being a difference in the other colors.
Yes.
But on the intrinsic model, there is a difference in virtue of reds being red.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it seems as if you can't have both. You either have difference across the board or intrinsic character across the board. So if Merleau-Ponty and Lyotard want to keep both,
Yes.
why do they do it? And how does this work?
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah. Ah. I mean, the only thing I can think of to say in reply to that is that I mean, I think I'm not sure whether Lyotard explicitly endorses that view, but I think it's a logical consequence of his position, because he's saying Saussurian type differential structures don't go all the way down. Okay, so he must be saying, you know, the figural is not differential in the way that language is. So he must be saying something like that. I mean, in Merleau-Ponty, I think all you could say is, well, yeah, there is a differential quality which kind of inflects how that's the best way I can put it. It inflects how you perceive the colour, but it doesn't totally determine it. So that you know, when you perceive a certain kind of red, then it is your perception, your response is inflected by different kinds of red. You know, there's the kind of pink of carnations, there's the red of blood, there's the red of the British pillbox, and so on and so forth. So all these are somehow working differentially to kind of inflect your perception, qualify it if you like, but it can't go all the way down. There has to be an element which is just red, and it's just different from green. And there's just kind of the phenomenological bottom line, as it were. Do you see what I mean?
Once he's taking why the red doesn't go all the way up. You say the differences don't go all the way down.
Yes. Yeah.
Why isn't there just something intrinsically there about the red of the blood, as opposed to something which is just different from pink?
I see what you mean. So why doesn't it go all the way up?
Yeah. I mean, where does it stop?
Oh, I see what you mean.
There seems to be, I mean, if he wants to posit some sort of level of naive perception,
yes.
You just have these colors, red and stuff, and then you get to the level of discourse where you can distinguish between violet and indigo and stuff. Is that the kind of thing that he's after, or is there a more
we're talking about Merleau-Ponty now. Unfortunately, I don't have the book with me, but if I did, I might be able to find the relevant section. But he does say, I mean, he does. You're right. I mean, you could go the other way and say, look, there's just the redness of blood, and that's phenomenologically basic, and that experience owes nothing to contrast with different, the red of my bottle of wine, or the red of the, the rose, or whatever it might be. It's just phenomenologically basic. I mean, all I can do really is repeat his position. He just thinks it's inflected by these that contrast with other experiences of the same colour. But I mean, are you adopting the position on this?
I am adopting the position that you can't have both.
All right.
Either one or the other, but not both.